She stood at the edge of the water, her boots sinking into mud that pulled at her ankles like the land itself was trying to swallow her whole. The real estate agent had already driven away, kicking up gravel and dust, glad to be rid of the property nobody wanted. 5 acres of standing water, of cattails choking the edges, of mosquitoes hanging in thick black clouds above stagnant pools. The neighbors watched from their tidy porches across the dirt road, shaking their heads, muttering into their coffee cups. She was 43 years old, alone, and she had just spent every penny she had on land that had been rejected by 3 generations of local farmers. They laughed at her that morning. They called her foolish. They said the old ways had no place in the modern world, and they meant every word of it. But she looked at that swamp, at that worthless, flooded, forgotten corner of the county, and she saw something else entirely. She saw cranberries, and that vision would change everything. Her name was Maggie Hale, though everyone in Millbrook called her Maggie. She had grown up 3 towns over, in a house with a small backyard garden that her grandmother tended with the kind of devotion most people reserve for religion. Maggie's grandmother had been the last of the true homesteaders in their family, a woman who raised 6 children through drought and depression, who canned everything that grew, who believed that the land would provide if you simply learned to listen to it. Maggie had sat beside her as a child, shelling peas on the porch, listening to stories about root cellars and rain barrels, and the year the cranberries saved the family from starvation. That story had stayed with her for 40 years. The winter of 1982, when the factory closed and Maggie's grandfather came home early, his lunch pail empty, his face gray with shame. There was no money for groceries. The garden was frozen under 2 feet of snow. But Maggie's grandmother had walked out into the marshland behind their rented cottage, wearing her husband's rubber boots and a coat held together with safety pins, and she had harvested cranberries from the wild bog that everyone else ignored. She made sauce, she made juice, she traded jars at the church basement for flour and salt and coal. The family survived that winter because of cranberries, because of a swamp. Maggie never forgot that story. It lived inside her like a seed waiting for the right season, but life had taken her far from that porch. She married young, to a man who worked in construction and drank too much on weekends. They had a daughter, Clara, who was the light of Maggie's life for 11 years until the divorce came and the custody battle took everything Maggie had built. She lost the house, she lost the savings, she lost the stability she had spent 15 years creating. Worst of all, she lost daily access to Clara, who moved 2 hours away with her father and a new stepmother who didn't much care for Maggie's old-fashioned ways. For 6 years, Maggie worked 2 jobs. She cleaned offices in the morning and waited tables at a diner by the highway at night. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, the kind of place where the heat worked in summer and failed in winter. She grew tomatoes in plastic buckets on the fire escape, just to remember what soil felt like. She watched cooking shows on a second-hand television, shows about farm-to-table restaurants and organic orchards, and she felt something inside her growing restless, something that felt like grief, but also like longing. Then her grandmother died. It was a Tuesday in March. Maggie was wiping down booth 12 when her phone buzzed with the news. She didn't cry at first. She just stood there, the rag in her hand, staring at the grease stains on the table until her manager told her to go home. That night she opened the shoebox where she kept her grandmother's things. Recipes written on index cards, a dried sprig of lavender, and a deed folded small to 5 acres of marshland in Millbrook County deeded to her directly with a handwritten note that simply said, "The bog remembers. Trust it." Maggie had never known about the land. Her grandmother had bought it in 1989 for $300 at a tax auction, a whim, a secret. She had never told anyone, and now it was Maggie's. She drove out to see it the following weekend. The GPS couldn't find the exact plot, so she asked at the general store, where an old man with tobacco stains on his beard told her she was looking at Henderson's Bog, the place where nothing grew and nobody went. "You own that?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "Lady, you've been swindled. That land's been on the market since before my daddy was born. Even the county don't want it for back taxes." Maggie drove down the dirt road anyway. She parked where the gravel ended and walked through brush that tore at her sleeves, and then she saw it. The water, dark and still, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. The cattails swaying in the cold wind. The silence, deep and ancient, broken only by the cry of a heron lifting off from the reeds. She stood there for an hour, her breath fogging in the March air, and she made her decision. She would not sell it. She would not walk away. She would farm it. The laughter started before she even broke ground. Maggie moved to Millbrook in April, renting a tiny trailer on the edge of town. The only place she could afford after draining her savings to pay the back taxes and legal fees on the bog. She bought a used pickup truck for $1,200, a rusted Ford with a cracked windshield and a radio that only played static. She started showing up at the hardware store, the feed store, the diner, asking questions about drainage and soil pH and cranberry varieties. Cranberries. The word itself was a punchline in Millbrook. "You can't grow cranberries in Henderson's Bog," said Earl Kowalski, who owned the largest dairy farm in the county and sat on the agricultural board. He told her this at the diner, loud enough for the whole lunch crowd to hear. "That water's stagnant. There's no drainage. You'll get root rot before you get fruit. My grandfather tried to drain that swamp in '62, lost $5,000 and his best tractor." They laughed at her methods. They called her foolish. They said the old ways had no place in the modern world. Maggie smiled and ordered her coffee to go, but the words cut deeper than she let on. She was 43, broke, and living in a trailer. She had no engineering degree, no agricultural training, no investors. She had a high school diploma, sore feet from years of waitressing, and a memory of her grandmother's hands in the dirt. That was all. And every person in Millbrook seemed to know that her dream was impossible. Her daughter Clara called on Sunday evenings. At first, Maggie didn't tell her about the bog. She said she had moved for a fresh start, that she had found a little place in the country. But Clara was 11, sharp and observant, and she heard the strain in her mother's voice. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked one night in May. "You sound tired." Maggie was tired. She was exhausted. She had spent the last 3 weeks wading through knee-deep muck, clearing deadwood and invasive reeds by hand because she couldn't afford machinery. Her hands were blistered and infected. Her back ached in ways that made her cry in the shower where nobody could hear. She had been bitten by insects she couldn't name, had fallen into hidden sinkholes of cold black water, had come home every evening so covered in mud that she had to rinse off with a garden hose before she could even enter the trailer, but she told Clara none of that. She said, "I'm building something, baby. Something special. Wait and see." The first real blow came from the county. Maggie had done her research. She had read every library book about cranberry cultivation. She had learned that cranberries were not like other crops. They were native to wetlands. They needed acidic soil, abundant water, and cold winters. They grew in bogs. The problem was not that her land was wet. The problem was that modern agriculture had forgotten how to work with water instead of against it. She drew up plans to create a cranberry bed system, using the natural contours of the land to manage water levels. She would not drain the bog. She would shape it. She would build dikes and install simple floodgates, using gravity to move water in and out, just as the indigenous peoples had done for centuries before industrial farming arrived. She submitted her plans to the County Agricultural Extension Office, hopeful, proud of her research. They denied her permit. Earl Kowalski had a cousin on the zoning board. The official reason was inadequate drainage infrastructure and concerns about standing water as a breeding ground for pests. The real reason, Maggie knew, was that they wanted her gone. They wanted her to admit defeat, to sell the land to a developer who would fill the bog with gravel and build storage units, to stop embarrassing them with her stubbornness. She sat in her trailer that night, the rejection letter on the table, and she wept. She wept for her grandmother who had believed in her enough to leave her this impossible gift. She wept for Clara, who she was failing all over again. She wept for herself, because for the first time, she truly wondered if everyone was right. Maybe she was foolish. Maybe the old ways were dead. But in the morning, she woke up, made her coffee in a tin pot on the propane stove, and she walked back to the bog. She would not drain it. She would not fight the water. She would find another way. Maggie spent June and July in a battle that nobody saw but the herons. She couldn't afford to hire engineers or buy heavy equipment. So she learned to build by hand. She borrowed books on permaculture and wetland restoration from the county library, books so old that the librarian seemed surprised anyone checked them out. She studied how cranberries grew in the wild, how they spread across acidic mats of sphagnum moss, how they produced fruit in conditions that killed every other crop. She started small. She cleared a quarter-acre by hand, pulling reeds and cattails until her shoulders screamed, laying down sheets of sand and peat moss to create raised beds above the waterline. She collected cuttings from wild cranberry vines she found growing at the edges of the bog, varieties that had survived there for decades without any human help, proven survivors of the very conditions everyone said were impossible. She worked from dawn until her body gave out, usually around 9 in the evening when the mosquitoes became unbearable. She ate peanut butter sandwiches and instant oatmeal. She lost 15 pounds she couldn't afford to lose. Her hair grew ragged, her skin turned brown and leathery, and her hands became a network of scars. The neighbors watched. They drove past slowly on the dirt road, shaking their heads. Some took pictures with their phones, posting them online with captions about the crazy swamp lady. Earl Kowalski told anyone who would listen that Maggie was destroying property values, that her hippie farming was going to attract pests and disease, that the county needed to intervene. In August, the county did intervene. An inspector came out, citing her for unauthorized earthwork and potential wetland violations. Maggie had to spend 3 days in the county courthouse, missing work on the bog, representing herself because she couldn't afford a lawyer. She brought her books. She brought photographs of indigenous cranberry cultivation methods. She brought soil samples that showed the pH was perfect, exactly 4.5, the acidic sweet spot cranberries loved. The judge was a woman named Patricia Okafor, the first black judge in Millbrook County history, and she had grown up on a farm in Louisiana that her family had worked for 100 years. She looked at Maggie's evidence. She looked at Maggie's hands, raw and scarred and honest. She dismissed the violation with a warning, but she held Maggie back after the hearing. "You're fighting the wrong fight," Judge Okafor said quietly. "You don't need to convince them. You need to survive long enough to prove them wrong. Can you survive?" Maggie thought of her empty bank account. She thought of the winter coming, the trailer's thin walls, the heating bill she couldn't pay. She thought of Clara, who needed a mother with a stable home, not a woman living in a tin box in a swamp. "I don't know," Maggie whispered. "Then find out," the judge said. September brought the first frost, and with it, a new kind of desperation. Maggie had managed to plant 300 square feet of cranberry vines, a pitiful patch that looked like nothing against the vastness of the bog. She had built crude dikes from sandbags and salvaged lumber, creating a system that could flood her beds in winter to protect the vines from freezing, then drain them in spring for growth. It was primitive, it was ugly, it was the best she could do, but the money was gone, completely gone. She had $217 left, and the propane tank was empty, and winter was coming. She took a job at the Millbrook Diner, the same one where Earl Kowalski had humiliated her. She worked the breakfast shift, 4 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, serving eggs and coffee to the very farmers who laughed at her. They didn't recognize her at first, or maybe they pretended not to. But word spread. The swamp lady was a waitress. The swamp lady had failed. The swamp lady was just another broken dream in a town full of them. Maggie smiled through it. She memorized orders. She refilled coffee with a steady hand. And every afternoon, when her shift ended, she drove her rusted truck to the bog and worked until dark. They laughed at her methods. They called her foolish. They said the old ways had no place in the modern world. The vines turned red in October, not fruit. Just the autumn color of the leaves, a deep burgundy that spread across her little beds like a whisper of possibility. Maggie didn't know if it meant anything. She didn't know if the vines would survive the winter. She didn't know if she would survive the winter. Clara came to visit in late October. Maggie had saved for 2 months to buy her daughter a bus ticket. She cleaned the trailer until it shone, hiding the cracks and the drafts with blankets and determination. She cooked a meal of chicken and vegetables, everything from the discount grocery store, nothing from her land because there was nothing to harvest yet. Clara walked with her to the edge of the bog. The girl was 12 now, tall and thoughtful, with her grandmother's eyes. She looked at the red vines, the handmade dikes, the water reflecting the gray autumn sky. "Mom," she said, "it's beautiful." Maggie started to cry, and she couldn't stop. She cried for the loneliness, for the fear, for the laughter that had followed her every day for 6 months. She cried because her daughter saw beauty where everyone else saw failure. "Do you think it will work?" Clara asked. Maggie wiped her face. "I don't know, baby, but I have to try. Grandma believed in this land, and I believe in her." Clara took her mother's hand. They stood there until the sun went down, 2 women at the edge of a swamp, believing in something nobody else could see. Winter came hard that year. The temperature dropped to 10 below zero in January. The trailer's pipes froze. Maggie wrapped herself in every blanket she owned, huddled beside a space heater that ran on electricity she couldn't afford, watching her breath turn to frost on the windows. She lost her job at the diner in December, cut back to seasonal hours, then let go entirely after the new year. She should have sold the land. She knew that. Any rational person would have sold the land, taken the loss, moved back to the city, found another apartment above a laundromat, found another diner, found another life of quiet survival. But Maggie was not rational. Maggie was her grandmother's granddaughter every week. She trudged through snow to the bog, breaking ice with a hatchet, checking her dikes, making sure the floodgates held. The water was frozen, but beneath the ice the cranberry vines slept, protected by the very flooding system she had built. The cold couldn't kill them if they were underwater. That was the old way. That was the knowledge her grandmother had passed down without even knowing she was teaching it. In February, Maggie's truck died. The transmission gave out on the dirt road half a mile from the trailer. She couldn't afford to fix it. She couldn't afford to tow it. She walked everywhere after that, through snow and ice, carrying groceries in a backpack, carrying hope like a stone in her chest. She applied for emergency assistance. She ate at the church basement on Wednesdays. She swallowed her pride and asked Judge Okafor for help, and the judge connected her with a legal aid society that was fighting a case against the county's agricultural board for discriminatory permitting practices. It wasn't much, but it was something. And then, in March, the ice began to break. The thaw came early that year, a false spring in late February that turned the bog into a symphony of dripping water and shifting ice. Maggie was at the edge of her beds, checking the dikes when she saw it. Green, not the green of algae or moss, the green of new growth, tiny, impossibly delicate, pushing through the waterlogged soil. Cranberry runners, sending up new shoots, surviving the winter, reaching for light. Maggie fell to her knees in the mud. She touched the shoots with trembling fingers. They were real. They were alive. They were growing. She spent March and April in a frenzy of work, repairing winter damage, expanding her beds, adding new cuttings from the wild vines that were now finally beginning to spread. She had no money for commercial fertilizer, so she made compost from kitchen scraps and leaf mold. She had no money for pesticides, so she introduced ladybugs and built birdhouses to attract insect-eating species. She had no money for advertising, so she started a blog, writing about her work on the library computer, sharing photographs of the bog's transformation. Nobody read it at first. Then 5 people, then 20, then 100. Something was happening. The photographs showed a landscape that didn't look like failure anymore. The water was still there, but now it was managed, channeled, purposeful. The beds were small but neat. The vines were spreading, and in the center of it all was a woman in rubber boots, smiling at the camera with mud on her face. In May, a reporter from the county newspaper came out. She wrote a small piece about the woman trying to farm the unfarmable land. It wasn't flattering exactly, but it wasn't mocking either. It was curious. The article brought a visitor. Dr. Samuel Okonkwo, a professor of sustainable agriculture from the State University, had read the piece online and driven 3 hours to see Maggie's bog. He walked the beds with her, asked questions about her water management, took soil samples, examined the wild cranberry varieties she had cultivated. "This is remarkable," he said, his voice hushed. "You're not fighting the wetland, you're partnering with it. This is how cranberries were grown for centuries before industrial agriculture. This is what we've forgotten." He offered to help her apply for a research grant. He offered to bring his students to study her methods. He offered, most importantly, to connect her with a cooperative of organic cranberry growers in the northern part of the state who had been looking for exactly this kind of sustainable, low-input cultivation model. Maggie stood in her bog, her grandmother's boots on her feet, and she felt the world shift beneath her. June brought flowers, tiny pink delicate blossoms on the cranberry vines, so small you had to kneel to see them, but there, thousands of them. The bees came, wild and domestic, drawn to the bog in numbers that made the neighbors stare. The water was clean, managed, alive with insects and amphibians. The ecosystem Maggie had nurtured was functioning, not despite the wetland, but because of it. Earl Kowalski drove past in his new truck, slowing down, staring. He didn't wave. But he didn't laugh either. Maggie was still broke. The grant hadn't come through yet. The university partnership was still paperwork and promises. But she had flowers. She had bees. She had proof that the old ways were not dead. In July, she harvested her first crop. Not a commercial harvest. The vines were too young for that. But she walked her beds and collected enough berries to fill a single bucket, dark red and firm. Tasting of the acidic soil and the cold water and the 2 years of labor that had brought them into being, she made cranberry sauce. She made it exactly like her grandmother's recipe, written on the index card in the shoebox. She carried a jar to Judge Okafor's chambers. She carried a jar to Dr. Okonkwo at the university. She carried a jar to the general store, where the old man with the tobacco-stained beard tasted it and said nothing for a long moment. "That's real," he finally said. "That's what cranberries are supposed to taste like." Maggie smiled. "That's what my grandmother taught me." August brought the harvest. The real harvest, the vines, now covering nearly 2 acres of shaped beds, were heavy with fruit. Deep red, perfect, abundant. Maggie had no equipment to harvest commercially, no wet-picking machinery, no sorting line. But she had hands, she had neighbors. And she had something nobody expected. Word had spread. The blog had grown to 10,000 followers. The newspaper had run a follow-up story. A regional food magazine had sent a photographer. And the Organic Cranberry Cooperative, true to Dr. Okonkwo's word, had sent buyers. They came on a Tuesday morning, 3 men in a refrigerated truck, wearing boots and carrying clipboards. They walked the bog with Maggie, examining the fruit, testing the sugar content, discussing her organic certification process. They didn't laugh, they didn't mock. They offered her a contract. "We can't pay what the big industrial farms get," the lead buyer said, "but we can pay fair, and we can guarantee purchase of your entire crop for the next 5 years if you maintain these standards." Maggie looked at her bog. She looked at the water, dark and purposeful, reflecting the August sky. She looked at the vines her grandmother had somehow known she would need. "Yes," she said, "the harvest took 3 weeks. Maggie hired help for the first time, local teenagers who needed summer work, paying them from an advance the cooperative had provided. They picked by hand, standing in the managed water, filling crates that were loaded onto trucks and driven to processing facilities Maggie had never seen. The berries were destined for organic markets, for natural food stores, for restaurants in the city that advertised farm-to-table menus and meant it. The final truck pulled away on the last Friday of August. Maggie stood in the empty bog, the water still, the vines stripped of fruit but healthy and strong, ready for the next season. She was tired, she was filthy, she was happier than she had ever been in her life. She walked back to her trailer, past the dirt road where Earl Kowalski's house sat. He was on his porch watching her. She waved. After a long moment, he waved back. September brought checks. Real checks, with numbers that made Maggie sit down at her kitchen table and cry. She paid off the back taxes. She paid off the legal fees. She bought a used but reliable truck. She fixed the trailer's pipes and insulation. And she rented a small house in town, a real house with a bathtub and a garden. A place where Clara could have her own room. Clara came to live with her that October full-time. The custody arrangement changed, not through lawyers and fighting, but through simple reality. Maggie had a home. Maggie had an income. Maggie had built something stable and real from the swamp everyone had called worthless. They laughed at her methods. They called her foolish. They said the old ways had no place in the modern world. But the world was changing. The restaurants were calling. The universities were studying her methods. The county was quietly rewriting its wetland farming policies, using her bog as a case study, and the neighbors, one by one, were starting to ask questions. How did she manage the water? What varieties did she use? Could they visit the bog? Could they learn? Maggie said yes to all of it. She gave tours. She taught workshops. She started a small nursery selling cranberry cuttings and bog plants to other farmers who wanted to try sustainable wetland cultivation. She hired 2 full-time employees, then 3. She expanded to 7 acres, then 10, leasing adjacent marshland that other owners had given up on. By the following spring, Henderson's Bog was no longer a joke. It was a destination. Food writers came from the city. Environmental researchers came from overseas. A documentary crew spent 2 weeks filming Maggie's methods, calling her a pioneer of regenerative wetland agriculture. Earl Kowalski came to her workshop in March. He stood at the back, his hat in his hands, and when the others had left, he approached her. "I was wrong," he said. The words cost him. She could see that. "My grandfather drained that bog because he thought water was the enemy. He thought the old ways were backward. He was wrong, too." Maggie looked at him. She remembered the diner, the laughter, the humiliation. She remembered every moment of doubt, every night of fear, every morning she had forced herself to walk back to the bog when every voice in the world told her to quit. "It's not about being right or wrong," she said. "It's about listening. The land was trying to tell us what it wanted to be. We just had to stop talking long enough to hear it." 5 years later, Maggie Hale stood at the edge of 20 acres of thriving cranberry bog, the water managed by gravity and wisdom, the ecosystem humming with life that industrial farms had destroyed decades ago. She had a staff of 12. She had a partnership with 3 universities. She had a daughter who was 17 and wanted to study environmental science, who had grown up believing that impossible things were simply possible things that hadn't been tried yet. The old trailer was still there, at the edge of the property, preserved as a reminder. Maggie visited it sometimes, on quiet mornings, making coffee in a tin pot on the propane stove, sitting on the step where she had once wept with exhaustion and fear. She would look out at the bog, at the water and the vines and the herons, and she would remember. She remembered her grandmother's hands in the dirt. She remembered the winter of 1982, when cranberries had saved a family. She remembered standing at the edge of 5 acres of stagnant water, her boots sinking into mud, while the neighbors laughed and shook their heads. They had laughed at her methods. They had called her foolish. They had said the old ways had no place in the modern world. But the old ways had built this. The old ways had turned a swamp into a sanctuary. The old ways had taught a woman to listen to water, to trust in acid, to believe in the patience of vines. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways, not because they are old, but because they are true, because they understand that the land does not need to be conquered. It needs to be known. It needs to be loved. And if you love it honestly, if you work with it instead of against it, it will give you more than you ever dared to dream. Maggie finished her coffee. The sun was rising over the bog, turning the water to gold, waking the bees, warming the fruit that would soon be ready for another harvest. She walked back to her house, to her daughter, to her life, carrying with her the deepest truth she had ever learned: the bog remembers. Trust it.